elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, once again, we want to welcome you to Society and the State. I'm Brian Hyde, along with my co-host, Connor Boyack. And you've probably seen some headlines in the recent past few weeks, months, or, well, let's face it, 3.5 years, regarding the Bundy family and a little unpleasantness that took place down in Bunkerville. And again, some other things that took place in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. I've had the privilege of being able to kind of have a front row seat of a number of these instances. I was at Bunkerville in 2014. I was not at the Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, but I did have a direct pipeline and direct contact with many of the players there who called into my radio show, actually traveled to visit me in my radio studio during that occupation. And I've been covering the Bundy trial down in Las Vegas ever since it started back at the end of October. So I know this generates some strong feelings. Connor, I know this is not something that has necessarily, had a stranglehold on you, but have you noticed that there are very few people in the lukewarm category? People are either solidly pro-Bundy or they're very anti-Bundy, and there's not a lot of in between.
Yeah, that's my perception as well. I think there's a lot of people who just don't see that this impacts them, and I think that's why we're doing this episode, to discuss some of the issues at stake in this trial and why they're more significant than just this one encounter with this one family. So I think a lot of people just, and let's be frank, probably the reason why I never gravitated onto it so tightly is because, like many people, we're very busy and there's a bajillion things happening that we can get angry about and, motivated about. And so, however, with this issue, dealing with, weapons and federal agents and public land, that creates, from my perception, this concoction of circumstances that either emboldens people or enrages them. And so that's what you've been in the thick of more so than most everybody else.
Well, and there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation that has been out about this from the very beginning. And so today I want to answer some questions, and Connor is kind enough to pose the role of the Grand Inquisitor here. He's going to ask me some questions, and I hope you'll play devil's advocate because while I, in interest of disclosure, I've been friends with Ryan Bundy for about 12 years. I've had a chance to get to know his family at a much deeper than superficial level over these last few weeks. And so I'm just going to come right out and say there were a lot of things I didn't understand at the time, even though I was at Bunkerville. But in retrospect, I have come away with a conviction that the Bundy family are, number one, good people. Far better. They've been portrayed as kind of a one-dimensional, anti-government headline in many media sources, but these are really, really good people. They have principles that they are trying to assert, whether you agree that they're doing it wisely or in a clumsy fashion. That's up to you to make your mind up over. But I think they've been horribly misrepresented, both by the government narrative and a media that really likes to sensationalize things when it suits its purposes.
You don't say.
Yeah.
What? Okay, so some listeners, perhaps many listeners, will be saying, Bundys? Who? What? So let's start with the nuts and bolts. Let's do a simple description of the facts in this case. What happened when, and what's the problem here?
Okay, the Bundy family is part of. They are part of the families who settled southern Utah, southern Nevada, and northern Arizona. If you've heard of the Arizona Strip, you'll know that there's an actual town out there called Bundyville. It's not a metropolis by any means, but basically their family's been there for a long time. They've ranched there for generations. Cliven Bundy and his family have been ranching the Gold Butte area for generations. And over the course of time, they have seen federal regulations, particularly those levied by the Bureau of Land Management, become so cumbersome and so restrictive that it was effectively putting them out of business. Mm-hmm. Because of this, back in 1992, Cliven chose to withdraw his consent to be managed by the BLM. He stopped paying grazing fees to the BLM. He tried to pay them to the state of Nevada since he said, look, the land is within your borders. I'll pay you for the use of it, but I'm not going to pay an agency that's working to put me out of business. The BLM, in the meantime, has sought to trespass his cattle off of that grazing allotment. They have used increasingly more coercive means to make that happen. And in the spring of 2014, actually mounted a very militarized, heavy-handed, I mean, we're talking 200-man task force with guys made up and armed up like soldiers, with FBI counterterrorism team, surveillance, listening posts, observation posts. I mean, very military in its nature to take the Bundy's cows. And when the Bundys put out a cry for help, and they did this via social media, hundreds of people from all across the country showed up to help them. Now, some of them came armed. Some of them came in the form of the citizen militia. Most of us went down there just simply because we perceived that there was an injustice being done, and we're just standing with them. I don't really care about cows that much. I don't really care that much about the public lands debate, but I did not want to see this family run roughshod over, and that's exactly what was happening.
So one of the criticisms of Edward Snowden doing what he did was that he did not go through the established process. If he had objections, if he had concerns, if he had allegations of misconduct or illegal activity, there was a process in place by which he could have resolved those things. And so that becomes kind of this side debate in the broader whistleblower discussion of, was he right to just, do what he did, unilaterally decide to release all this information? Of course, his supporters and himself would say, well, look, that process was a joke. And in fact, he did try to, alert superiors and was kind of shut down. He had no confidence in the system. And so he decided to do what he thought was right. Would it be fair to say that in the case of Clive and Bundy, that there was protocol for his managing his objections, for appealing, for seeking leniency from the federal bureaucrats whose actions he objected to, and so did he pursue those? Is he, like Edward Snowden, just kind of stepping outside of that process he was afforded and saying, no, I have no confidence in it, or what's the issue there?
See, I too had heard that Snowden initially tried to go through the system and use the checks and balances within the system, and in fact found that the system was more interested in protecting itself. And I think a very similar thing happened in the case of Clive and Bundy. He fought it in court, but you got to remember, he's fighting against an agency that can write its own rules and regulations. So if the BLM got an unfavorable ruling in court, they would simply change their rules or change the regulations, come back, and the courts would say, oh, well, then we have to find for them. So it's, unless you have a lot of money and the ability to write the rules of the game as you're going, that's a losing proposition. And that's why eventually he realized, I will never get any kind of resolution here that could be fair if I'm fighting an unelected, virtually unaccountable federal agency within the federal courts.
Now, critics will say, okay, that's all well and good, but they had guns, and that's wrong. That just changes the equation. Like, maybe there's virtual and civil disobedience and just maybe a human chain around the property, right, and saying we will not comply. But the fact that there were these weapons, it was an occupied, I can't remember what the allegation is, occupied presence or occupied protest with weapons, and wasn't there a building in play? There was some federal building involved that they entered into.
It was that was up in Oregon. That was at the Wildlife Refuge, and what they were administrative buildings on federal property. So it wasn't a true federal building. Federal building, when you go in, you go through a metal detector. You have security and cameras everywhere. These were buildings on a federally managed wildlife preserve. There was no one there. They didn't go in and clean everybody out at gunpoint or anything like that. But it was portrayed as an armed takeover.
Yeah.
The question you asked, though, about, but they had guns, and this was true, at Bunkerville in 2014. This is where the Second Amendment is seen in its proper role. And I know for a lot of people, it's like, but they were actually, standing up to armed law enforcement. And this is where you have to understand some of the universal rules of self-defense. One of the universal rules is whoever is the aggressor typically loses that mantle of innocence. So if the Bundys and their supporters were the aggressors, if they were the first ones to present weapons or to initiate the threat of violence, they would lose that essential mantle of innocence. But they weren't the first ones to do it. And in fact, this is what came out in this latest trial was the BLM had done numerous behavioral assessments to try to detect what kind of a threat would they be. And not just, have they said we'll do whatever it takes to protect our cattle, but what kind of capability do they have? And out of 4 threat assessments, every one of them said they were the lowest possible threat. But when the government showed up to take their cattle, they came with, again, hundreds of armed men. They came with counterterrorism, snipers, the whole 9 yards, and they treated it like a military operation against, a hostile enemy force.
Now,
and that was before there was any standoff.
Okay, so that was prior to. So the Bundys would assert that in this case the government is the aggressor, and therefore they lost their mantle of innocence, and therefore having arms in self-defense of their land or their grazing rights, because it's not their land, right?
In this case, it was primarily the presence of arms for those supporters who showed up armed was in defense of the Bundys and their rights. I'm not trying to drag up or reopen old wounds, but Ruby Ridge and Waco were 2 circumstances in which the federal government had some very questionable rules of engagement and use of violence. And no matter how you slice it, innocent people died as a result of heavy-handedness.
Yeah.
And it was a very real concern for the Bundys. And, the superseding indictment that the prosecution set forth and said, well, this is why, the Bundys need to be prosecuted. They said they gave this false narrative. They lied to the American people and said, we are in fear of our lives because we have armed men surrounding us, and we worry that it's going to be another Waco. And the government maintained that was an out-and-out lie. But evidence that came forward during the trial showed, no, actually, there were armed men surrounding them, including snipers, including, electronic surveillance, and they had a very realistic fear.
So would the government assert the opposite of what the Bundys do, namely that the Bundys are the aggressors because they are unwilling to do what they're being told, they are not paying, what they're supposed to, they've escalated the situation? What, from the government's standpoint, I feel dirty asking questions like this. What are they supposed to do to enforce the law if the person who is refusing to comply continues to refuse to comply? At some point, doesn't the government have to back up its enforcement of the law with violence, right? And so would their position not be that the Bundys were the aggressors for being unwilling to comply? And if so, if that is the government's position, why are they wrong?
That's an excellent question, because it allows us now to look at this whole conflict with the Bundys and the BLM is just a symptom of a much larger problem, and that is the federal government acting within its proper limited role? And that would be to preserve and to protect and to guarantee rights to life, liberty, and property. And in the case of the Bundys, let me restate the question. Maybe I'll throw the question back at you.
Yeah.
Are you duty bound to help a government agency if it's in the process of destroying your livelihood or depriving you of your rights? Do you have a duty to obey whatever bureaucratic dictates it gives you?
The government would say perhaps not a duty to assist, right? But yes, a duty to obey. In other words, get out of the way and let us do our jobs. And so is it the case that the Bundys were standing between the federal agents and their job, which it sounds like was what? Removing the cattle or somehow, managing the land a different way, getting the Bundys to go off the land. And so if the Bundys are standing between the government and their objective, then, is that not willful interference, right? So is the government's position not that, the aggression was on the Bundy side, they were unwilling to do what was required of them by the law, and in so doing, they became the aggressors because they escalated the situation to the next degree. Thus, clearly, I think the government would lose in saying that was a justified amount of force. If all the threat assessments were low, the fact that they were blowing things out of proportion with snipers and surveillance and such heavy-handedness, sure, that's a problem, right? But wouldn't some amount of coercive response be needed to bring someone like Cliven Bundy to heel if he was stubbornly refusing to comply with the law?
I would say yeah, but at the same time, there is such a thing as civil disobedience, and in this case, the Bundys were not the ones to introduce violence into the situation. You have to understand that multiple times before, the federal government had tried to trespass cattle off of their land and were thwarted in their attempts to do so because the Bundys would not cooperate, or the sheriff would not allow the necessary cooperation, would not let the brand inspector, the brand inspector said, we're not going to sign off on this. What has to be done before those cattle can be transported across state lines. Auction houses said, we will not take these cattle. And so it thwarted those attempts. But when's the last time you heard of, and assuming that this is about bringing them into compliance, over and over again, the BLM said, well, it's because he's not paying his grazing fees. When have you ever heard of a 200-man army being sent with very aggressive rules of engagement over a debt?
Okay, and
they could have attached a lien to his
right.
ranch or something like. I mean, this was money we were talking about. It wasn't that they were out there
harming
anyone, including harming desert tortoises or harming the land. So it was a civil action to trespass those cattle off. But when they came in with, very heavily armed. They tore out water infrastructure that Cliven Bundy had put in, paid for out of his own pocket. That was not part of the trespass. They killed cattle, which was not part of the order. They were just supposed to gather and ship them off.
And so where you have this objection to the response that the government brought, clearly you must have a theory, right? If the government was so heavy-handed, doing things they weren't authorized to do, doing things unnecessarily when they could have imposed a lien, why were they doing this at all, right? Why is the government doing this? Does this fit into some larger pattern of behavior? Is the BLM trying to expand its authority? Are they trying to, shut down any amount of civil disobedience, to make an example of people, keep us submissive? What is Brian Hyde's theory as to why this happened, why it went down the way it did?
There are a lot of theories out there, and I first of all have to say I don't know for sure what all the facts are. What I have seen, though, leads me to believe that, number one, the BLM was in the process of restricting the rights and the opportunities for ranchers. And I say that with the understanding there were 52 ranchers that were ranching in that area of Clark County.
Uh-huh.
There's one named Cliven Bundy. Only one of them has stayed in business. The water rights and the grazing rights that they own are separate from ownership of the land. They gain those rights through beneficial use. They purchase those rights and they perpetuate those rights, but they have to exercise them for them to remain valid. And what the BLM was doing was it was adjusting what's called the AUMs, which is the measurement of how many cows you can have on a particular grazing allotment.
Uh-huh.
They would shrink that number down to where it was so few cows, they would lose their water rights because they weren't exercising those water rights. And that's why Cliven refused to go along with them. His attorney back in 1992 told him, if you sign the agreement or if you sign for these grazing permits, you're signing away your water rights, without which he has nothing.
Interesting. So the title of this episode implies that people should care about this case and that it's a bigger case than just a rancher with cows that is worried about grazing rights. Why is this case significant? Why should people care?
Because this comes down to the role of the federal government and whether or not it exists to serve us and to serve the states, or whether we are simply property to be managed. Essentially, are we cattle, to be, rounded up and dictated to according to the whims of these agencies? The BLM has a lot of good people in there. So I don't want to make it sound like, you should hate anybody who works for the federal government. But I would hope that people could question, when you have an agency that is not accountable to elections, like Congress would be, yet it has the ability to make rules and laws and carry them out with the force of law, including that enforcement mechanism that you referenced earlier, you would think that government would want to tread carefully and make sure that it's not being overbearing or it's not being heavy-handed. In the case of the Bundys, what it's showing is if government wants to make something happen, it has its version of, we'll do whatever it takes. And in order for it to do whatever it takes, that means trampling on your rights, denying due process, and perhaps unjustly imprisoning you for a couple of years while waiting to bring you to trial.
So that's what I want to talk about next is despite multiple threat assessments showing low threat to no threat type of assessment of Cliven and the others that were involved, they have until recently been in jail, or is it prison?
Both
for a very long time.
Even though they weren't convicted, they were held and subjected to the very same standards as convicted prisoners.
So theoretically, they were and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And yet, unlike an actually innocent person, they were confined to incarceration through the trial. I think Cliven is still there at the time of recording this episode, right?
Yep.
Why were they being held, and on what basis were many of them finally released?
Because the prosecution, and in its indictment, maintained that these were such dangerous individuals and they posed such a risk to the community at large, or they posed such a flight risk that they could not be trusted to show up for trial. And yet it was after the information came forward, interestingly enough, from the government's witnesses. It was the government's witnesses who inadvertently revealed information that should have been turned over in discovery, and that triggered a number of Brady violations. I think there were 6 at last count that the judge found had occurred, but essentially there was a very incomplete or distorted view of the defendants and the threat that they posed. And when the judge came to realize that this was not squaring with their actual demeanor, their past record, or that someone had played fast and loose with the facts. By someone, I mean the prosecution. She agreed to give them pretrial release, which Cliven refused just on the principle that he says, I'm not going to go out and be a dog on a leash.
So to clarify for the listener, a Brady violation stems from a Supreme Court case named Brady, in which it was ruled that a defendant is entitled to have access to any evidence that may be exculpatory. In other words, any evidence that may be favorable to their point of view, that may help their case. Historically, what has happened, what still happens, as is evident in this case, is that a prosecution who has access to everything will only give the defense things that the prosecution wants them to have. And clearly that is unfair, that is unjust. And so a Brady violation is when the prosecution refuses to disclose potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, which they can use to mount a defense. How else is a defendant able to, defend themselves if they don't have access to the property, the information, the data that the prosecution has amassed? And so in this case, as in many other cases, the prosecution was engaged in misconduct by being unwilling to provide the defense information that helped them.
And for those who wonder, how serious is that? I mean, is this just a technicality? Is this just they didn't dot this I or they didn't cross this T? I've had 2 friends, one of whom just retired from law enforcement after a very long multi-decade career, one of whom is still in law enforcement. But these 2 friends, both independently of each other, said one Brady violation would be enough to prevent me from ever doing law enforcement again. That's how serious it is, because it's a denial of due process.
Yeah. Which the Constitution theoretically protects. And so
right.
Hence the gravity here. So much so that Attorney General Jeff Sessions, I don't often like using that title and that name together. He's not my favorite. But he's ordered an investigation. Why? And talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because of the prosecution's alleged misconduct, now the Department of Justice is looking into it. And this is where, I don't know, some people are very hopeful. Yeah, finally something's going to happen. But I would remind you that the system, the federal government, is very good at looking out for itself. So I'm hoping that there is some accountability. This is something that Ammon Bundy referred to when the mistrial was declared and he was standing out there talking to reporters outside the courthouse. And they said, well, if the judge decides that this is a mistrial with prejudice, meaning it cannot be revisited, you can't be charged with these same charges again, is that going to settle things? Or are you going to just go back to life, as you can? And he said, it will accomplish giving us our freedom, but it will not solve the problem, which is, how do you hold government accountable when it starts exercising or usurping powers that it should not be exercising in the first place? So there's a larger question there. Some of the allegations that have come out, too, from one of the BLM investigators who was on this case and has since been dismissed from the case, was he was actually working through the channels in the agency and saying, I'm seeing some very unprofessional conduct. I'm seeing bias. I'm seeing more of a drive for vengeance than a drive for justice here. And when he tried to send that up the chain of command, they removed him from the case. So he released an 18-page letter. His name's Larry Wooten, and he is a whistleblower. And this is information that never made it into the latest trial. But if it does come back to another trial, I'm certain they'll be hearing from him. They'll probably put him on the stand. And again, it's one of those cases where, how do you solve a problem when the system is more interested in protecting itself than going after justice.
You mentioned that there previously were many more ranchers, and Cliven is kind of the last lone wolf out there doing this. Is this because the pressure and the activities of the BLM have created a hostile working environment, and others have thrown in the towel where Cliven has, stubbornly refused to submit, or what's kind of the situation there?
I think for some of them, it would probably include, onerous regulations, just making it very difficult for them to do their job. More than likely, though, economic pressure because of that. When you shrink the number of cows that they can legally graze down to a certain number, then they're not going to make any money.
Right.
It's not in their interest. And so, when someone comes along and says, well, we'd like to go ahead and take over your water rights or buy them up, it becomes easy to sell if you're faced with the prospect of, or you can just slowly descend into financial ruin.
My perception is that cases like this are helpful in waking people up to the realization that their own government is often their greatest enemy. So often our enemies are portrayed to be different skin color, different countries, different religions,
political parties.
Different. Sure. But so often you see a case like this when people realize that their own government can be the cause of, as you just point out, perhaps financial ruin, perhaps, a loss of personal freedom, destroying a family, taking property, ending your life. And it's tragic that so often I find that until people have an intimate experience with their own government in this way, it sounds like the Bundys were already very politically awake long before this event happened. But in many instances, someone will have a confrontation with the government, in my experience anyways, and it's then that they wake up and they realize, oh my heavens, the government can do this? Just the other day, in fact, just yesterday, before we're recording this episode, we got a call from a business owner who was served an administrative subpoena and signed by a bureaucrat, not even a judge. They came in and they seized property that they're now unable to sell because they're allegedly investigating something. And just these people are beside themselves. Like, wait a minute, the government isn't even allowed to do this. And it's so unfortunate that in so many cases, we're all raised up in a system of patriotism and how great our government is, and let's all pledge allegiance to it and sing its songs and so forth. And then it's the scales slowly, if you're lucky, fall away from your eyes as you come to realize that situations such as this one, events such as these, paint a much different picture about the power the government has, the lengths that they're willing to go to exert that power, assert that power, protect and even expand that power, and how sad it is and how rare it is. That's where I was driving the question is it's very rare to find someone who will stand up and say this far and no further, and I'm going to fight back, and maybe that means I'm going to arm myself to make sure you're on your best behavior and you don't crush me. But this is so rare, and unfortunately, the fact that it's rare, I think, makes it harder for the broader public to sympathize with it because it's then maligned as fringe, extreme, yep. Right? Because we're so not used to people asserting themselves against their own government, when in fact our government was founded on precisely that, and how tragic it is that we celebrate that independence, but not by hearkening back to that sedition and rebellion and stubbornness. But just this superficial, fireworks and food and the like.
We've forgotten what it looks like. And because of that, there's like a form of Stockholm syndrome that kind of holds sway over a lot of the population. And when somebody does stand up, it's almost like it's our duty to pull them back into line.
Crabs in a bucket, right?
We're crabs in a bucket. Yep. So I don't know if this is going to change anybody's mind. More than anything, I would hope that what has come out is that the government wasn't above lying to try to get its way. So maybe we should question what it tells us and not hold it quite as gospel until we have done a little bit of looking ourselves. So on that note, we've got another great conversation coming up here in our next episode. We're going to be talking with John Dougal about what's happening in Puerto Rico. And we hope you'll join us then for Society and the State.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.